Hey guys, so welcome to a special edition of Platitude in which we actually combine what you're doing in your Cheetos lab and chemistry and environmental science and stats, and we put it all together, and I kind of add in my little bit of history to kind of put all of that stuff into perspective and create the story around it. So really I want to talk about the history of presidential decisions and the government and how we deal with agriculture and farming and resources and resource allocation. And so it really starts with Teddy Roosevelt and the Progressive Era. And he, as part of his square deal, as part of his big plan, his policy, he included conservation. And this was monumental at the time, because at the time we're still in the Gilded Age, and for the first time the government is putting conservation of resources over the bottom line. And this is really interesting because Teddy decided that having resources for the future, for future use, was important. Unfortunately, presidents don't stay in office, or fortunately, I don't know. Depends on if you like Teddy Roosevelt or not. But eventually, we as a country revert to a much more hands-off kind of government. We revert to allowing businesses to do what they need to do. And because of that, there's a huge buildup of really keeping the farmer down, which is why after World War I, the farmers entered the Great Depression in the 20s. So it wasn't roaring for them, right? And pretty much stayed that way through, well, got worse in the Great Depression, especially with the Dust Bowl and whatnot. So then we have this rise around the 60s and 70s of what's called agribusiness. Now, strangely, in the 60s and 70s, you also have the rise of the environmental movement. And in Nixon's case, he actually supports the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and supports and recommends all of these legislative bills that work to protect certain aspects of our environment. But at the same time, you have this consolidation of farms. So if you look at the numbers on the output side, in 1960 there were 400,000 farming firms, and that's about the businesses, right? And then they went through this revolution of consolidation, and by 1970, a lot of those businesses had come together, whereas other ones, especially the smaller ones, actually went under and they went bankrupt. Today, we have 70,000 fewer firms producing food. Now, this concentration of companies has been a concern for farmers since the 1850s. This is not a new concept for farmers. Farmers are really like the underdog in pretty much every story. They've always felt like the small fish in a shark bowl. Poor guys. And they accuse these larger agribusinesses of using monopolistic practices, of using rebates for larger companies that help them, like shipping and banking, whatnot. And they use government subsidies and tax breaks, all to fix prices at the expense of those small family farmers. Family farms are falling away at a huge percentage. It's a very hard life to lead. But if we look at the numbers and we go through history, farmers' share of food value hovered at about 40% in the 19-teens and 20s. It dipped to a little under 30% in the Great Depression because, well, the Great Depression. And then World War II hit and it surged to almost 60%. And here's what happened. The government actually covered the cost. So what they did is they raised farm prices, like what farmers actually got for their food, but they lowered consumer prices, and then the government filled in the gap to make sure that the farmers actually made a living wage during wartime, and to make sure that farms didn't go under, to make sure that they were still producing in the war effort. Post-war, it leveled back off to 40%, and it stayed that way through the 60s, but by the 70s, it started this steady decline because of that consolidation that I was talking about, and because of other reasons. And so today it's about 25%. Farmers get about 25% of the dollar, which kind of sucks. Now, part of this is due to rising consumer demand in what are called convenience foods. And I'm not just talking junk food, although that is a big part of it. The fact that we can buy frozen dinners and pop them in the microwave and 3 minutes later we have dinner, boom. It's not great, but it's edible, right? As opposed to actually making an entire meal from scratch. There's also, people are willing to pay a bit more for chicken that's been deboned instead of buying the whole chicken and cutting it up yourself and like filleting it off the bone if you don't want the bone in there. No, I'm guilty of it. I don't want to do that, so I go and I buy the package of boneless, skinless chicken breasts because it's easier for me. That and I don't know how to debone a chicken. There's also this thing called contract farming. So big companies like Campbell's or whatnot will actually contract out to farmers and say, okay, we're going to take on the lion's share of the risk. Here's all the stuff that you need. This is what we want. This is when we want it. Get to work. And so farmers give up a lot of their independence and freedom of choice in exchange for a guaranteed paycheck. And it's really like the only way they can stay competitive within this market. You also have to think about the rise of supermarkets. It used to be that you would go to the local grocery or the local farmer's market and you would just buy and sell in these smaller markets. But now, like since the 50s, there's been this huge rise of supermarkets. And like Walmart and Safeway and Albertsons and Kroger and this demand for producing more and more and more, and so it's hard for farmers to keep up with this rising demand for food. Now the crazy thing is that a lot of smaller farms are being purchased and bought up for what is called they're absorbing all of this farmable land or arable land to actually produce non-food, things that we as humans cannot eat or do not eat. So we have these large tracts of land that are producing corn for ethanol production, which is fuel. Now, this helps with our fuel costs, supposedly, right? But at the same time, it's cutting down on our food production. And I find this very interesting because right now in the US, 1 in 6 people face hunger. 1 in 5 children face hunger. 1 in 3 minorities face hunger on a daily. That's insane to me. And we're like, yeah, I want to make gas. I want to make fuel. It's insane. When you think about it, we have a very finite amount of land for crop development and crop production. So we have 349 million acres of arable land. To kind of put that in perspective, California, the state of California, is 103 million acres. So we have three and a half areas of like the size of California, right? So I find that interesting that we decide to use all of that land. 80% of that land we use for 4 crops. Feeder corn, soybeans, alfalfa hay, and wheat. All but wheat is used for livestock feed. 80% of 349 million acres, our finite amount of arable land, and all but wheat is used for livestock feed. And just to kind of let you know, we only use 62 million acres for wheat. The rest of it is for livestock feed, right? And the crazy part is all vegetables. You combine all vegetables that we grow, it's less than 3 million acres. Okay, that's insane to me. So an argument has been made that in order to protect our arable land, to conserve watersheds, because especially out west where it's much more arid and requires massive irrigation and pumping of water and the destruction of watersheds, an argument has been made to move our diet away from meat, to cut down on the amount of land that's used for grazing, the amount of land that we use for livestock feed, the destruction that's happening to the watersheds. And all of this is built around this idea of resource allocation and what's actually important to us. And I feel like if you just look at those numbers by themselves in isolation and you compare it to our numbers of hunger, it's interesting that we're going to choose convenience foods, fuel, and livestock over children and hungry people. But you know, I'm kind of a hippie that way, right? So maybe that's something to think about as you're doing your Cheetos lab and as you're looking at the actual nutritional value of Cheetos and how popular Cheetos are and how popular junk food is. And really, to put it out there, you should definitely check out Food Inc. It's life-changing. But keep that in mind as you're working through that lab. Keep in mind, you know, what you're sacrificing for your convenience foods. All right, until next time.